The last time I slept through the night was in the summer of 2019. Since then, my internal clock has been perpetually set to respond to emergency pagers. I can't remember the exact date it changed, only that Claire, my wife, was still alive back then, and life was mapped out in stable routines. That was before everything shifted, before the phone call that told me I'd never see her smile again. Now, my days at Great River Medical Research Center begin and end with the same dull ache behind my eyes. My name is Dr. Isaac Smith, and I'm a trauma and critical care physician. I've seen thousands of patients over the years, gunshot victims rushed in from gang territory 2 blocks away, hapless tourists who crashed rental cars on the interstate, and children with terminal diagnoses, their entire futures stolen by rogue cancer cells. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened on that Tuesday morning. I was in the lounge, flipping through a patient chart, when a nurse poked her head in. "Dr. Smith, you're needed in the main conference room. Something about a research briefing." I pulled myself away from the chart. "Any idea what it's about?" She shrugged. "They said it's hush-hush. Only the department heads were paged." Without more than a nod, I tucked the chart under my arm and followed her into the hallway. When I arrived, the place was nearly full. Heads of nursing, oncology, cardiology, neurology, even a couple of surgical leads were all milling around, sipping lukewarm coffee from paper cups. At the front of the room stood a tall, meticulously dressed man. I recognized him instantly. Richard Thorne, billionaire tech mogul with a philanthropic streak. A man who'd poured countless millions into hospital expansions, state-of-the-art equipment, and secret medical projects. Even among the wealthiest donors, he was in a league of his own. "Dr. Smith," he greeted me with a warm smile. "Glad you could join us." I managed a polite nod. "Mr. Thorne, I heard you have some big news." He beckoned everyone to their seats. "Thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen," he began, pacing the length of the conference table. "I know you all have busy schedules, so I'll be brief. We're on the verge of something extraordinary, an achievement that, if successful, will transform not just Great River Hospital, but medical science as we know it." I folded my arms across my chest, leaning back. We'd been teased with breakthroughs before, cutting-edge cancer treatments, advanced robotic surgeries, new gene therapies. But something in Thorne's voice was different. He gestured to a man standing beside him. I recognized Dr. Adrian Keller, the head researcher of a newly formed biotech division that had set up shop in a wing of Great River Hospital about 6 months back. Keller was the sort of figure who rarely came out of his lab. Thin, wiry hair, and a lab coat that looked one size too big for him. When he made eye contact, I saw something smoldering behind his eyes, pride or maybe fear. "Dr. Keller and his team have developed a drug called Revenalex," Thorne said, letting the name hang in the air. "A compound designed to stimulate post-mortem neural activity for a short, controlled period." A murmur spread around the room. Thorne's eyes shone. "Yes, I'm aware it sounds like science fiction, but it's not. We have rigorous data from animal models that suggests a deceased subject can be temporarily reanimated, brought back just long enough to speak, to share their final words, or perhaps to reveal hidden details about their passing. Let's be honest, closure is something we can't quantify in medicine. Yet it's what every grieving family desperately wants." The room fell silent. I remembered every conversation I'd had with families over the years, explaining that their mother, father, or child hadn't made it. More than once someone had grabbed my hand, tears streaming down their cheeks, pleading for any way to say goodbye. I always told them gently, "I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do." Now, apparently, there was. Dr. Keller cleared his throat. "The protocol we're testing is humane. It's a brief, artificially induced synaptic revival that grants anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes of consciousness before a complete cellular shutdown. Our current experiments have shown no adverse side effects in carefully measured doses. Thorne, satisfied, resumed his monologue. The trial is scheduled to take place tomorrow. I've made certain the best people are on hand. He paused, voice dropping lower. The first subject is Lillian Thorne, my own wife. Silence. Lillian Thorne had died a month ago, an aggressive brain tumor that no amount of money or experimental therapy had been able to stop. We all knew about it. Half the staff had been roped into her care. She had passed away in a private hospice suite, with the press swarming outside the gates. Now, Thorne wanted to bring her back. The meeting disbanded with a hush. Dr. Keller walked past me. "Looking forward to seeing you at the demonstration tomorrow," he said. I nodded. "Sure, I'll be there," but something told me we weren't ready for what would happen next. The following morning, I woke up before my alarm and arrived at Great River Hospital earlier than usual. After flashing my badge at the security station, noting there were extra guards posted, I saw a new sign on the entrance to the research wing, "Authorized personnel only." Inside the lab for this trial, I found a group of about 10 people clustered around a hospital bed. In the center was Richard Thorne, hair meticulously combed, wearing a tailored suit despite the sterile environment. Dr. Keller stood beside him, flanked by 2 other research scientists in matching lab coats. A handful of higher-ups from the hospital lingered near the edges, their faces masks of watchful anticipation. And on the bed, Lillian Thorne's body. I'd seen her once before, though only in passing, when she'd been wheeled into an MRI suite months prior. In death, she looked pale and thin. A thick blanket draped her from the chest down. Dr. Keller nodded a greeting as I approached. "Good morning, Dr. Smith. We're about to begin. Could you please observe from here?" He gestured to a spot next to an EKG monitor that was wired into the bed. I could see the tension in Thorne's stance as Dr. Keller drew a syringe from a small metal tray. The fluid inside the syringe was translucent, tinted a faint purple. Revenalex. My pulse raced as Keller then carefully inserted the needle into Lillian's arm and pressed the plunger. The drug slid into her veins, vanishing beneath pale skin. The monitors beeped quietly, lines tracing across the screen. Flat, 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 and then an anomaly. The EKG flickered, a tiny wave that suggested neural pathways were sparking. Seconds passed. For a moment, nothing happened and I felt a rush of relief. But then Lillian's eyelids twitched, her lips parted. Then slowly, impossibly, her eyes opened. As her head turned on the pillow, she saw Richard Thorne standing there, and for an instant there was recognition. "Richard," she rasped, voice raw from disuse. "Where?" Thorne stepped forward. "Lillian, oh my God, Lillian." She gave the kind of smile that says, "I know you, I've missed you." Those first seconds were almost holy. "You brought me back," Lillian whispered. "Thank you." Thorne leaned in. "I couldn't let you go. I promised, till death do us part. And maybe, not even then." A few in the room smiled through tears, but then Lillian's face changed. Her eyes darted around as if seeing something invisible. She pulled her hand from Thorne's grasp, breath quickening. A murmur spread across the monitors, some strange neurological spikes. She grabbed for Thorne's arm with an unnatural force. "This isn't the first time, Richard," she said, voice wavering. "What? Lillian, what do you mean?" She shook her head, tears spilling. "You've done this before." All the blood drained from Thorne's face. What are you talking about?" She began to weep, with ugly sobs heaving from her chest, but her eyes, those eyes were no longer human. Panic flashed through the observers as Dr. Keller gestured for a nurse to begin sedation, but it was too late. Lillian's body convulsed violently. Her mouth, once parted in a loving smile, latched onto Thorne's throat. A wet, awful sound filled the room as she tore into his flesh. Blood splattered the crisp tiles and the monitors. Screams erupted. Everything moved in slow motion as Lillian, this reanimated corpse, brutally held on to her husband with inhuman strength, jaws working ferociously, ripping at muscle. A nurse tried to pull her away, only for Lillian to twist around and sink her teeth into the nurse's forearm. Desperate to help, I saw a crash cart standing by the wall. I yanked open a drawer and grabbed a large pair of surgical shears. Lillian was on her feet now, moving with a jerking gait that defied logic. Thorne lay on the floor in a pool of blood, unmoving. He might already have been dead, truly dead this time. Keeping the shears in front of me, I tried to approach from Lillian's blind spot. She was crouched over the nurse, sinking her teeth into flesh with wet, horrible sounds. For the next few seconds, Lillian wreaked havoc in the lab room, biting anyone in sight with inhuman speed. Then, something slammed into her from the side, a security guard brandishing a taser. That was my opening. Without thinking, I rushed forward and jammed the shears into her temple. Hot gore spattered my arm. I could hardly believe that it worked, as a final breath of air escaped Lillian's lips before she collapsed in a heap, no longer moving. But just then, the wounded nurse coughed, spitting blood onto the floor and convulsing, alarmingly similar to Lillian's. The doctors, nurses, and technicians who had been bitten also started squirming, their wounds looking infected in the worst possible way. And that's when I realized that whatever the drug had done to Lillian was now spreading. Dr. Keller hovered behind me. We need to open these doors, get the infected to an isolation unit. But before I could answer, a scream erupted from behind us. The infected nurse had risen, her eyes, empty of humanity, locked onto a lab tech. In a flash, she lunged, jaw snapping. The lab tech stumbled back and the nurse was subdued by another taser. But it was too late. She had tore into his shoulder, ripping flesh. The infected tech named Morris backed away, eyes wide. No, he stammered, as if reading my mind. Please, Dr. Smith, he choked out. I don't want to hurt anyone, just lock me up. Fine, I said abruptly, turning to the glass doors. Open them. Let's isolate him in another room. He's not fully turned. Morris didn't resist as we half-dragged him to a side corridor within the sealed wing. We eased him onto the floor of the MRI suite. I'm sorry, I whispered, stepping back as one of the staffers pulled the door shut from the outside, then engaged the electronic lock. Morris was sealed in. I glanced at Dr. Keller. Now what? He stared at the floor, breathing hard. We have to run before they transform. We need resources. We need to test their blood. Maybe we can create an antidote. His voice cracked. I never wanted this. I'll get to the control room, see if we can figure out how to contact the outside. With no time to waste, I left Keller and edged into the corridor, stepping over Thorne's body. While running down the blood-stained hallway, I then followed a sign reading, Control Room, Authorized Staff Only. Inside, monitors lined the walls, showing doctors and nurses huddled behind barricades of equipment. Some staffers pounding on locked exits, and a few bodies lying motionless. But just as I started looking for a way to stop the hospital lockdown, Dr. Keller sent me a message on my console. Dr. Smith, come back immediately. We found additional syringes labeled hyperdosage. This is beyond anything I've tested. It must be what Thorne insisted on. He must have bribed the trial researchers to get them to agree. We need to talk. I took one last glance at the security feeds before sprinting out of the control room. So apparently, Thorne had poured everything into permanently reanimating his wife, and now the entire hospital was paying the price. Even so, I couldn't shake the sense that there was another layer to this crisis. I dialed up Dr. Adrian Keller's message log on the console, scanning for details. There, in half-intelligible bullet points, suspected infiltration from corporate sponsor, hidden formula, subjects may develop cognition, access denied, location, Lab 7. It was all I needed to confirm a suspicion. Someone else was pulling the strings, somebody who wanted these reanimations to happen on a massive scale. And they might have stashed an actual antidote somewhere. Great River Hospital is a ticking bomb, and the entire city could be next. I hurried toward Lab 3, where Keller's frantic messages had come from. Immediately, the scene was worse than I'd imagined. Overturned tables and cabinets smashed. Keller wasn't there, but Dr. Ben Carter, my best friend, knelt beside a dying colleague, pressing gauze on a vicious scratch wound. He looked up as I entered. "Isaac, we lost half our team. The rest are trapped. 2 of them turned on us in minutes. I've never seen anything spread so fast." Ben pulled me aside. "I got a message from Keller. He claims he's found a formula that might reverse the infection. But it's locked up in a restricted lab, something about a final step hidden away. The hyperdosage vials we found are only partial. Then we need to find Keller," I said. "But first, we have to secure these people." Before he could answer, the steel door behind us groaned. Outside, a crowd of reanimated staffers banged on it. Across the room, a lab tech tried using an anesthesia sedative on a newly bitten patient, only for that patient's eyes to snap open with unnatural speed, teeth gnashing. The tech stumbled back and Ben leapt in, holding a pistol I hadn't realized he had taken from a security guard. In a single shot, the newly infected crumpled, but the hush that followed was worse than the chaos. As doctors, we had pledged to save lives, not end them. Then through my earpiece, a crackle of static. "Dr. Smith, Keller here. I'm at Lab 5 now. It is urgent. Multiple anomalies in the infection. Some reanimated retain cognition. Retain cognition. This crisis might be more than a mindless outbreak." "Isaac," Ben hissed, "that door won't hold. Let's get these survivors to a safer spot, then find Keller." I nodded. We hustled around the corridor, heading for an internal stairwell that might lead us to Lab 5. Midway, the flickering light revealed a figure in blood-stained scrubs, standing stock still. I froze, motioning the group to halt. Ben lifted his pistol. The figure's eyes were open, yet something about them shimmered with awareness. As we inched closer, I realized that the head tilt, the parted lips, and the stiff posture were all intentional. A subtle intelligence. The figure's voice rasped out, "Help me, it hurts." Then it locked eyes with me. "Claire," it whispered. "Claire was my wife's name. Impossible. How do you?" The figure lunged forward, half snapping in a flash of aggression, but Ben squeezed the trigger, a single shot tearing through its skull. It dropped, eyes going blank. A nurse in our group, pale with shock, whispered, "It spoke. It said your wife's name. Move now." That was all I said in response, as we reached Lab 5. Inside, we found Dr. Adrian Keller hunched over a counter crowded with half-labeled vials. He looked up, relief flashing across his gaunt features. "Isaac, thank God. We have multiple anomalies. The standard dose and even the hyperdose are just prototypes. We need the omega-level formula. That's the only real shot at reversing this." Keller forced a deep breath. "I told Thorne we had a miracle on standby, but we never finished it. Our corporate sponsor cut the research short. There's a hidden lab, Lab 7, where the true final compound is locked away." "Why hide it?" I asked. Keller pressed a shaking hand to his forehead. "Because they never intended for Thorne's gift to humanity to become an actual cure. The biotech firm named Titan Biomedical believed in reanimating the recently dead for information extraction." He let out a hollow, bitter laugh. "I spent weeks telling myself I was wrong, but I've seen the raw data. The anomalies, the irregularities, everything lines up. My darkest suspicions are true. They discovered that some reanimated humans can talk. Some can think. If you can question them, you can get anything they took to the grave: bank codes, missile launch protocols, blackmail material. Titan stands to make billions." Ben stared at Keller, voice tight. You said we can fix it. How? Keller pointed to a set of digital schematics. Lab 7 has the missing chemical sequences. We combine it with the hyperdose vial, then we apply an electrical synergy to burn out the reanimation factor. At least that's the theory, but we're not guaranteed to find it intact. And even if we do, the zombies could attack us at any moment. They are smarter now. I turned to the small cluster of survivors from Lab 3. Stay here, I said gently. Barricade the doors. We will find Lab 7, get the formula, and come back. So the three of us, Keller, Ben, and myself, set out again, leaving behind a ragtag group of petrified survivors. On our way to the restricted sector, we passed the administrative offices. The once pristine hallway was a ruin of shattered glass walls and toppled desks. A battered sign read, Richard Thorne, Executive Office. My gut tightened. Thorne had died in the reanimation fiasco, but maybe his private records would yield a clue about Lab 7's location. We forced open the office door. Inside, a fancy desk lay overturned, the drawers dumped onto the floor. But a single laptop remained unscathed, half buried under a bookshelf. As we rigged it quickly, the laptop whirred to life, demanding a password. Try 123, Keller guessed. Thorne's usual default. The screen blinked, access granted. He never was subtle, I thought. On the computer, one file was already open. Revenalex, Omega Master Plan. The text inside chilled me. Objective. Reanimate carefully selected cadavers like political figures and corporate rivals to glean sensitive info. Revenalex partially tested. Stage 2 Omega, induce outbreak for large-scale data harvest. Controlled intelligence. If reanimated can speak, we record. If they remain docile, we refine. Lab 7 is the fallback. My chest tightened. No antidote was mentioned. Ben read over my shoulder. Then why is Keller so sure we can fix this? He glared at Keller. Are you leading us on some wild goose chase? I stood, laptop in hand, anger boiling. We won't know until we see Lab 7 for ourselves. Let's go. Continuing toward the restricted research wing, we heard sporadic gunfire. A side corridor revealed a battered group of hospital security officers, pinned by half a dozen reanimated. They were out of ammo, swinging rifles like clubs. One guard locked eyes with me, shouting, "Help!" We rushed in. Ben fired a few quick shots, dropping 2 of the infected. Keller used a fire extinguisher as a blunt weapon, smashing another's skull. The security officers, galvanized by sudden backup, tackled the rest, finishing them with brutal efficiency. Richard Thorne had personally paid out of pocket to staff the hospital with the best of the best. These were ex-military, private contractors, trained to handle crises most hospitals would never even imagine. If only they would have been there when the unthinkable happened. Their leader, a tall woman with the name patch Parker, saluted us. Thanks. We lost contact with the rest of our team. The outbreak, we can't handle it. Some are too fast. Some talk to us trying to get us to lower our guard. What's your plan? Ben answered before I could. Lab 7. We think that's where a real solution might be, or the closest thing to it. So we gained a small escort. Parker and 3 security officers, all carrying mostly spent rifles. They had some sidearms left, a few magazines. At last, we reached the sealed door with a sign reading Restricted, Level R7. As suspected, it was a fortress-like barrier with a biometric lock. Keller approached, punching in codes, pressing his palm to a scanner. Still recognized me, he murmured. Titan must not have fully revoked my clearance. The door hissed, sliding open into gloom. We stepped into a state-of-the-art lab, weirdly untouched compared to the carnage outside. Steel counters, computers, and cryochambers lined the walls. But the first signs of trouble were the bullet holes in one cryotank and the thick black fluid that dripped from inside it. The floor was smeared with footprints of both human shoes and bare, twisted feet. Ben aimed his flashlight at a half-smashed console. I noticed a label, Omega Sequence Scrapped. Keller hurried to a large containment unit in the corner. "This is where the final chemical sequences should be stored," he said breathlessly. "If they're intact, we can piece them together with the partial code I have." He began typing on a console. A progress bar blinked, accessing. But we soon realized that we weren't alone. Suddenly, from a side corridor, a shape raced in, not shuffling, not staggering, but sprinting with inhuman speed. One of the security officers yelled, and all chaos broke loose. They fired a hail of bullets, but the creature bobbed and weaved, letting out a guttural hiss that almost formed words. It then lunged at the nearest guard, teeth tearing into his throat. The man gurgled, dropping his rifle. Parker shouted, emptying the last rounds into its back. Finally, it collapsed, but the guard's throat was gone. There was no saving him. Keller hammered at the console in mounting panic. "Hurry, these files are encrypted. I'm close, but..." Ben turned to me, eyes blazing with desperation. "We need more time. Let's hold the corridor." We formed a defensive ring around Keller, who continued working. The computers beeped and hummed as reams of data scrolled. At any moment, more infected could burst in. Parker signaled her remaining officers to hold position. Minutes passed in a tense standoff. Then Keller finally exclaimed, "I've got it." He yanked open a small storage locker, pulling out a vial labeled Omega Cure, incomplete. But then Keller frowned. "This is just the precursor. We still need to cross-reference it with fresh infected blood for it to bind properly. The system says so." He gestured to the console. "Something about adaptive proteins." A moan from behind made us spin. One of Parker's officers had been scratched earlier, and now he was slumping, face going gray. "No, not me," he gasped, shoulders shaking. But we all saw the fresh black lines. Our blood donor for the final step might be forced upon us. The guard named Hensley backed away, tears in his eyes. "Stay away from me," he croaked. Parker walked up and pinned Hensley's shoulders gently, tears welling. "I'm sorry, but maybe this can save you." I stepped in to help hold him while Keller swiftly drew a syringe of black-red blood from his arm. He rushed back to the console, hooking up tubes and a microcentrifuge. As the machine spun, Hensley convulsed. "Don't let me turn," he slurred, voice half gone. Parker shushed him, blinking away tears. "Stay with us." Keller stared at a readout on the screen. "Integrating infected proteins, 80%, 90 done." He pulled out a new vial, swirling with a strange, iridescent color. "We inject him now. If it's going to work, we'll see it in minutes." Keller carefully delivered the injection. At first, Hensley screamed, back arching. Then he collapsed, chest heaving. The black lines across his face paused like a freeze frame. The entire group watched tense. But just then, Hensley groaned again. The color that had returned to his face vanished. He yelped in pain, black lines surging once more, even darker than before. Parker tried to steady him, but he screeched, eyes brimming with the same lethal intelligence we had seen earlier. In one savage motion, he tore himself free, biting Parker's wrist. She screamed, stumbling back in shock. Hensley's mouth parted, forming twisted syllables. "So, sorry must feed." With no other choice, Ben fired his gun, almost immediately, ending Hensley's torment. Blood sprayed the console as Hensley's body dropped to the ground, lifeless. Parker collapsed, panting, staring at her fresh bite. No, God, no. Our one success had proven the cure was fundamentally flawed. We were right back to a nightmare scenario. Amid the shock, I noticed Keller's posture shift oddly. He started scooping up notes, transferring them to a data stick. My gut tightened. "What are you doing?" He froze. I'm saving the research. If we can find a real lab later, maybe we can." A beep from the console drew my eye, External upload, Titan server. Betrayal jolted through me like lightning. You're sending it to them. After everything we learned. Ben stared, fury brewing. Keller, you can't be serious. Keller's voice wavered. They threatened me. They said if I withheld data, they would ruin me and my family. I had no choice. I still thought we could fix this, but Titan was always pulling the strings. Even now, maybe if I send them the partial synergy, they'll show me the complete fix. In that moment, I understood. Keller had been complicit from the start. Or at least coerced. My hands clenched. You caused all these deaths. He tore the data stick out, stuffing it into his coat. You can't possibly understand. If we can't cure it ourselves, we need Titan's resources. I'm not letting more people die just so we can keep secrets from them. People are already dead, I shouted. And you're giving them the very tool they wanted, this reanimated espionage weapon. You're handing them a doomsday device. Before he could reply, Parker groaned. She pressed a hand to her bleeding bite. We're out of time. The reanimated might be on their way, she gasped, voice trembling. We have to get out. Keller stammered. We can still create a version of the cure for ourselves. I have partial vials. If we get to an actual production lab, maybe we can finalize it. There's a sliver of hope. We heard more infected flooding into the main corridor. The stench wafted in, thick with decay. They're coming, Ben snapped, grabbing Parker under the arm. She tried to stand, eyes fluttering with shock. A partial sedation formula might keep her lucid for a while, but who knew? We retreated through a secondary door, stumbling into a dimly lit corridor that presumably led to the hospital loading docks. But then they appeared. 3 infected, twitching with unnatural speed, blocking our path. Their eyes flicked over us with vile intelligence. One spoke in a guttural voice. Stop, or we tear you apart. Parker, half delirious from the bite, lifted her rifle. Go, she croaked to us. Then she unleashed the last rounds in the magazine, riddling the lead infected with bullets. It screeched, stumbling. As we ran away, the other 2 zombies rushed her, ignoring the gunfire. She roared in defiance, bashing them with the rifle. The corridor echoed with snarls, shrieks, and one final scream. Then silence. Parker, Ben whispered, eyes wet. We had no time. The other routes would be swarming soon. Clutching the Omega Cure vials, Keller and I dragged Ben around the corner. The corridor opened into a battered loading bay. Sunlight filtered through a collapsed section of roof. Keller rummaged in his coat, pulling out the partial vials. We have enough for a few doses, he muttered. They might stave off infection if any of us are bitten, but it won't last. We need full production facilities to finalize the fix. At that moment, a noise to our left. Another infected officer pounced from behind a toppled crate, going straight for Ben's throat. They tumbled, wrestling. I rushed to help, but the infected bared bloody teeth, biting Ben's shoulder. I smashed the attacker's skull with a crowbar. He went limp, but it was too late. Blood seeped from Ben's fresh wound. My best friend lay panting, eyes wide with panic. No, Isaac. I fell to my knees beside him, tears burning. We have the partial sedation. We'll hold it off. Ben shook his head. That's not a real cure, we both know it. The new wave of black lines already streaked his neck. He grabbed me by the collar, voice trembling. Promise you will finish this. Blow the lid on Titan. Don't let them use the dead like this. I choked back a sob. We can at least try, I rasped. Keller grabbed my arm. We have to go, Isaac. If we die here, none of this data matters. I squeezed Ben's hand, tears slipping. I'm sorry, I whispered, pressing the pistol to his temple. One shot ended it. The echo thundered in my skull. My friend was lost. Keller dragged me, half catatonic, into the cargo bay exit. The fresh morning air assaulted my nostrils. The hospital had been on total lockdown, sealed doors, emergency barriers, no way out. But now, it was clear something had overridden the system. Bodies littered the parking lot. Helicopter blades thrummed somewhere overhead, but not close enough to help. We had only each other, and the partial vials of a non-existent cure. We crept among the debris, hugging a line of vehicles, scanning for a way out. If we could slip through the side gate, maybe we'd find a safer district or some outside help. Then we'd share the data, exposing Titan to the world. At least that's what I told myself. Suddenly, a battered paramedic emerged from behind an ambulance, shrieking, "Stay back." She'd obviously seen too many infected. We raised our hands, stepping closer. She wore a gore-stained uniform but didn't appear bitten. "We're human," Keller said. "Just two doctors." The paramedic, name tag Sarah Lynch, lowered her guard. We tried a field hospital outside. The reanimated overran it. The only safe zone might be a few blocks away. Someone said there's a local quarantine station, but I don't know if it's still standing. Then a savage scream. From between two parked trucks, a monstrous zombie charged, its jaw unhinged, eyes blazing with that unnatural cunning. It slammed into Sarah, cutting her off mid-sentence. Thanks to the close distance, Keller fired a single bullet to the beast's head. "Go, go," he hissed. "They'll hear that." We dashed deeper into the lot, the paramedic stumbling beside us. A swirl of dust kicked up from a passing helicopter. I glimpsed infected shambling near the hospital's main entrance, forming a hideous throng. In that second of distraction, a shape showed up behind me. It was another intelligent zombie. It grabbed my left arm, sinking teeth into my forearm. I jerked away, smashing it with the crowbar, but it clung with savage fury before finally collapsing. The wound throbbed, black lines already creeping outward. Keller's eyes went wide. You're bitten," then I saw it. His other hand gripping his side, his lab coat dark with spreading blood. Somehow in the chaos I hadn't noticed, but he had, and he'd said nothing. I sagged against the side of a burnt-out police car, mind spinning with the knowledge that everything we'd done was about to crash down. "Keller," I gasped, "the partial sedation. Give it to me." He started rummaging for a vial, but hesitated. "It'll only buy you time, maybe an hour. The advanced formula. We never actually found it. We found an incomplete version that relied on reanimation synergy. The true final piece, Titan never implemented it. It doesn't exist. We can't replicate Zero." I stared at him, the last shred of hope dying. "So there's no real cure." He shook his head, tears brimming. "I wanted to believe we could fix this, that we'd salvage something. But the data is incomplete. Even that meltdown we tried with Hensley was a flop. We have nothing. All that heartbreak, all those labs were built on nothing." "Then it's over," I whispered. Sarah cringed, stepping back. "Please, I can't watch another person turn." But Keller knelt, injecting me with the partial sedation anyway. Heat flared through my veins, dulling the immediate agony. The black lines slowed, though I felt them thrumming beneath my skin like a ticking clock. Then, without hesitation, Keller injected himself too. His breath hitched as the drug took hold. He let out a shuddering sigh, rubbing a hand over his face. "Buys us both time," he murmured. "Not much, but enough." This was it, a doomed extension, a stay of execution. We trudged across the final stretch of the parking lot. My arm pulsed with infection, the sedation biding me seconds, minutes, or maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. Keller was at my side, burdened by guilt and the worthless research. Sarah turned to face us, tears in her eyes. "There's nowhere safe. The city beyond might be even worse." She clutched at the data Keller had handed her, shaking. "I'll try to get out, show someone what happened here, but..." I forced a small, bitter smile, numbness creeping into my limbs. "Better one of us escapes to tell the truth." She looked at me, at my bite wound, and choked on a sob. Then, with a trembling nod, Sarah turned, picking her way around the vehicles toward an open gap in the perimeter. I watched her go until the swirl of dust obscured her figure. Godspeed. Keller sank to the ground, burying his face in his hands. I never wanted this. Gazing at the sunrise, I let out a shaky breath. We tried. We really tried. Keller reached over, squeezed my shoulder. I'm sorry. My eyes drifted shut, the black lines throbbing. All that effort, all the heartbreak, only to discover the final formula was a lie from the start. No wonder Thorne's note said, "No indefinite antidote." He was tricked, just like the rest of us. I pictured Claire, my wife, and the quiet funeral I never got to attend properly. I wondered if, in some twisted corner of this experiment, her memory was being used again. At least it's over. The sedation might keep me lucid for a few last minutes, but already the edges of my mind frayed, a hunger I couldn't quell. Then came Keller's voice, barely above a whisper. We should end it before we turn. He lifted the crowbar, trembling. I can't face what comes next. A wave of acceptance washed over me. Yeah, I murmured, blinking at the rising sun. Better we die ourselves than do what Lillian did to Thorne. In the final moments of clarity, I clutched Keller's arm. People out there, eventually they'll know. Sarah has the data. He nodded, tears in his eyes. Let that be enough. That's the end of this story. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, as it would help me out more than you can imagine. I appreciate you, and I'll see you soon.